Okay, welcome to our webinar on the Summit of the Teaching Profession. Today and tomorrow we have ministers and union leaders from the highest performing education systems sharing their experience and practice with the aim to raise the status of the teaching profession. And the evidence and data I'm going to show you are basically just prepared as a backdrop for this conference. Now, raising the status of the teaching profession is easy to say, hard to do. And actually, if you look at the data, we ask teachers to what extent they perceive that the profession is valued in society. And you can see only in Singapore, Korea, and Finland, do you have a clear majority of teachers where that is the case. On the other hand, at the other end of the spectrum, you have countries like Portugal, Sweden, and France, where you have 1 in 10 or even less teachers saying that their profession is valued in society. So clearly lots to do. Now, you can ask yourself to what extent it matters, but in fact, when you look at this chart, you can see that the percentage of teachers who agree that teaching is valued in society is actually quite strongly related to excellence in mathematics performance on the PISA test, for example. Now, we do not know what the causal nature of that relationship is. It could be that, in countries where teachers do a very good job, results are good, and also the teaching profession is respected for its job. Or it could be simply that in a country where the status of the teaching profession is high because of the high cultural value, great people are going to be attracted to the profession and will do a great job that is then reflected in good results. We don't know that from this data, but the bottom line is that there is a relationship between the value placed on teaching and the outcomes that we see in education. And that brings me to the themes of the summit, and I'm going to start with the second theme, which we are right now discussing at the summit, is about new pedagogies. How can we prepare young people for their own future rather than, our own past in the future? You can see that in the past, technology was somewhere in the smartphone, then the virtual reality and real world started to merge, and today everybody's connected. Now that's basically what technology has done to people, but the dark side of it is also that we live in the kind of post-truth world where truth and fact are sometimes losing currency, and also while we are connected, in fact, algorithms are now sorting us into groups of like-minded people, and that creates a kind of echo chambers that basically amplify our own views, but often leave us uninformed of other arguments, opposing views, and in some way also polarizing our society. So we need to take both of these sides together. Here's some interesting data on this. We asked 15-year-olds, what they think about the internet, and basically in virtually every country, a majority, but in some countries, up to 80%. Our hosts in Portugal are a good example. 8 out of 10 15-year-olds say that they feel bad if they are not connected to the internet. So basically, being connected has almost become like breathing air or drinking water. We also see that the time that students spend online out of school on a typical day has significantly increased between 2012 and 2015. That's just 3 years. In some countries, it's almost double. So significant shares of time devoted to the virtual online world. So it has an ongoing influence on how students learn and teachers work as well. Add to this that, the kind of things that are easy to teach have also become easy to automate, to digitize, to outsource. And we've seen a decline in the demand for routine cognitive skills, a rise in the demand for non-routine analytic skills and also social skills. So what this really means is that we need to think harder about, the learning resources and how we use them most productively, including the technology, to think harder about the learners, who are they, how they learn, and to think about the educators, teachers, the coaches, the mentors, the facilitators, and of course the content. What knowledge, skills, attitudes, and values are important to be successful in tomorrow's world? I mean, that should drive the kind of pedagogies that we deploy in the classroom. At the OECD, we have been putting quite a bit of effort on this and came up with this framework where, everything starts with disciplinary knowledge. That's very important. But we also put at the premium the epistemic understanding. Basically, today success is perhaps less about memorizing lots of formulas and equations and more about being able to think like a mathematician. It's about less than memorizing facts and figures about history and names and places, and more about thinking like an historian, thinking about understanding how societies build their narrative and how that narrative may unravel at another time. So thinking like a scientist, being able to what it means to draw evidence-based conclusions. So this epistemic understanding is a very important and of growing importance in the world in which we live today, where the kind of disciplinary knowledge is declining rapidly in value. But again, the world no longer rewards us just for what we know. When Google knows everything, the world rewards us for what we can do with what we know. So the skills dimension is important. We're talking about cognitive and metacognitive skills, about social and emotional skills, and also physical and practical skills. And last but not least, the hardest part in the structural systems is always to look at attitudes and values. In fact, we had a very interesting presentation from Singapore today explaining to us actually how they put values at the center of all of this. And then what they teach, the content knowledge, is just basically there to frame those kinds of values. And the capacity of people to mobilize cognitive, social, and emotional resources in a given context is then what creates competency. And at the heart of this is always agency. Now, that's been something that people have been saying for some time, that in this world, it's a question of taking initiative, having a clear sense of what is right and what's wrong, having sensitivity to the claims which other people make, and also a good understanding of our own limits and of collective action. And we don't live alone in the world. Co-agency was also framed to be very important here. Co-agency, sort of the issues around relationship, but also about how we learn, the co-creation of content knowledge in the classroom, sort of at the heart of all of this. Now, when you ask yourself, what do we know about these things? Actually, we try to measure agency in a very simple form in PISA 2012 assessment. We call this, in the context of mathematics, mathematical self-efficacy. And we could actually see that even though this was a quite, modest and simple measure, it was actually one of the best predictors that we have of country performance in mathematics. So those kinds of issues are really important. But then the question, of course, comes, what kind of competencies do we value most? We've put three things at the center. One is the capacity of people to create new value, to formulate and create outcomes that are innovative, that are fresh, that are original, and that contribute something of intrinsic positive worth. The capacity of people to take a step back, to reconcile conflicting viewpoints, tensions and dilemmas is very important in today's world. There's few things are black and white, and most things require us to deal with kind of multiple constraints, multiple kind of challenges. And then last but not least, the moral and intellectual maturity with which people can reflect and evaluate what they do, taking responsibility. So those are three fundamental classes of competency that in many countries are now at the heart of what they're doing. Now, what are the implications for pedagogy? It's to do with anticipation, being open to the world, being receptive to new ideas, being willing and able to question the established wisdom of our times. And often, schools do the opposite. We teach students to think in specific ways, as opposed to being open to, see where, how to connect the dots where the next innovation is going to come from. Reflection, again, taking a critical stance, choosing, stepping back from what we know, and then putting that into action. So those are three important levers that are mutually reinforcing and basically bring us from the what question in education to the how question, to the question of pedagogy. Now, that's what we can say, that's what countries aspire to, but the reality often looks very different. I'd show you here some interesting pilot data from Ontario in Canada. This actually tells you to what extent these ideas that I just presented are covered in the instructional system, in the intended curriculum. In the different subject areas, the colors here represent the different subject areas. You can see, for example, critical thinking and communication, problem solving are quite prominently presented in the curriculum of Ontario. If I go to creative thinking, you know, in the sort of second category, a little bit, reflection on the competency development cycle, yes, action, anticipation, much less so. And then in the last segment, you know, global competence is quite prominent in Canada, but entrepreneurship is something that we could not find present, so prevalent in the current curriculum. You contrast this with Japan, the picture is very different. No? Remember, critical thinking was the #1 in Canada, is not so prominent in Japan. A little bit in the humanities, a little bit in physical health, a little bit in math, but not so wide across the curriculum. In turn, respect did not get that much prominence in Canada, it's the #1 in Japan. So you can see countries actually respond in very different ways to the 2030 aspirations that they have in common. And when you look at this across countries, it looks like this. You can also see some of the areas are covered really well, others much less so. I highlighted the central importance of this concept of agency, you know, of students' initiative, of being able to mobilize their cognitive, social, and emotional resources. It's a lot related to entrepreneurship, but you can see here that entrepreneurship is not really visible in many instructional systems. We talk about it, but you look at the curriculum to see where is entrepreneurship actually, you know, framed, and you can see very little evidence of that. Now, some people say it is all a question of just adding more time to the curriculum, not just, you know, having 1 more hour of math will get you better math outcomes, having 1 more hour of science will get you better science outcomes. But, you know, while this is true within countries, when we look at this across countries, we actually found that the relationship was more negative. Actually, the more students spend time learning, the less well they came out in the international comparison. And the answer, you know, to this is actually quite simple. When you look at the time students spent learning in school in blue here and the time students spent studying after school in yellow, you can see this varies enormously. Now, you take the United Arab Emirates, where students learn close to 60 hours, and you take Finland, where it's just around 35 hours, huge differences in the volume of time that students spend learning. But when you look at actually the learning gains per hour of instruction, you see that in countries like Finland or Germany or Switzerland or Japan, students learn a lot in very little time. And in the United Arab Emirates, students learn very little in a lot of time. So it's not about the volume of time, it's how we use this time. So that's really where 21st century pedagogies come into. And of course, technology always plays a role. No? Technology can expand access to content. It can support new pedagogies. It can provide a platform for knowledge creation for teachers, and it can provide feedback that is much faster, much more granular. Huge potential. But again, you look at the evidence base, and the intensity of technology use is only, you know, positively related to outcomes up to a point, whereas we can see in sort of the majority of cases, actually technology is more related to poorer outcomes. No? Technology can amplify great teaching, but it doesn't replace poor teaching. No? In one way, you know, this doesn't say that technology isn't working, probably it is. It's a matter of saying that we don't yet have the pedagogies, the kind of instructional methods that help us leverage the potential of technologies to actually lead to improved learning outcomes. Last but not least, our data also show that when we ask teachers to what extent, you know, being more innovative in teaching is going to lead to greater recognition. And you have only about a quarter of teachers who that's the case. So that is an important barrier as well, even if only a perceived barrier. I'm going to skip that just a moment, because I want to get actually to the second theme, which is about, or in the summit, it's the third theme. It's about teachers' well-being, about teachers' confidence, and about teachers' self-efficacy. Everywhere there are growing expectations on teachers, and in fact, in the summit we talk about this. You know, society expects more and more from teachers that goes well beyond the transmission of content. Teachers are really seen as sort of agents with students who are basically taking care of students' well-being in a much more holistic way than we often assume so. And there is evidence that well-being factors actually impact motivation, self-efficacy, job commitment. Teacher attrition is in some countries an issue of big concerns, often high costs also, and growing teacher shortages are everywhere being in discussion. Now, when we survey teachers, we found that the vast majority of teachers actually is quite happy with their jobs. You know, you can say 9 out of 10 teachers are satisfied with their performance in the school or satisfied with their job, enjoy working at the school where they are, and so on. Of course, these are only the teachers who remained in school, but that's a quite positive picture. You ask yourself, you know, what are the drivers of job satisfaction? And one of the things that, you know, may surprise readers is that, you know, we didn't find much of a relationship between things like job satisfaction and class size, or even job satisfaction and teacher pay. Where we did find a very strong relationship was between the degree of professionalization in the profession and job satisfaction. Now, basically, where teachers have a higher degree of professional knowledge, a higher degree of professional autonomy, better and more collaborative teaching culture, these things seem to be having a very important relationship with job satisfaction, and also with teacher self-efficacy, and also with the perception of the status of teachers. So professionalism, very, very important driver of self-efficacy, job satisfaction, the kind of things that we might link with teacher well-being. And I must say, those are the only metrics that we currently have. We actually have surprisingly little evidence on the well-being of teachers. And you can see countries come out very differently on this. Now, we try to sort of compare countries on measures of, you know, teacher professional knowledge, that's in blue here, on the degree of professional autonomy, to what extent do teachers have discretion over, you know, designing a structural environment in red, and then the extent of the collaborative culture. Now, you can see big difference. Now, Estonia comes out very, very strong on this, mainly because they give their teachers, you know, an amazing work environment where teachers can really be very innovative, very creative, and so on. When you look at Shanghai in China, another high-performing system, you can see they derive their main strengths through a very strong collaborative culture where teachers have plenty of opportunities to collaborate, to work together in very different ways. And so different sources of teacher professionalism, and also a lot of variability. And as I said, you know, one of the most important driver that we could find of teacher job satisfaction and also of teacher self-efficacy. What is behind professionalism? Well, it's things like public confidence in professionals and the profession, in kind of preparation and learning opportunities that we provide, not just before teachers getting into schools, but more importantly, every day when they are in school. Has to do with collective ownership of professional practice. To what extent is, you know, am I really sort of part of the development of professional practice? And it has to do with the decisions that are made in accordance with the knowledge of the profession. It's not about I do what I think is right to do, but I do what I know is right to do because the profession has so established. And obviously also about acceptance of professional responsibility. The relationship with money, you know, that what you can see from this chart is it's not so easy to buy professions. No? There's actually, in most countries, on the right side of the chart, very little of a relationship between spending per student and learning outcomes. It's more interesting when you look more closely at how countries invest their money. Now, one way you can spend money and also support professionalism is to pay teachers well. And most countries still have a long way to go. Teacher salaries are not competitive with salaries of, you know, degree holders in general. Some countries, yes, but in most countries not. But there's also a lot of variability, even if you account for the wealth of countries, in the relative importance that teacher salaries have. Now, where the green bar goes up, teachers are quite well paid. Where the green bar goes down, teachers are not so well paid. Let me focus sort of on two countries in the middle, Japan and Korea, and you can see they pay their teachers relatively a little better than the average. But more importantly, and that's the blue bar, they also spend a lot of resources on giving teachers time to do other things in teaching. Preparing lessons, evaluating lessons, taking part in professional learning communities, taking part in professional development. Those things cost money, but countries like Japan, Korea, and many high-performing education systems actually make this a priority. And then, you know, they pay for that with larger classes. So you see, when they have to make a choice between a better teacher and a larger class and a smaller class, they actually invest in the quality of teaching. And what's interesting, you know, Japan and Korea is exactly where the black dots crosses the horizontal line. These are average spenders. They're very high-performing education systems, but they're not very expensive education systems. If you look at sort of a couple of places further to Greece here, Greece spends in sort of GDP-adjusted terms as much on education as Korea does and Japan. But, you know, they spend their money differently. In the case of Greece, a lot of resources go into smaller classes, and also teachers don't work that much. But even Greece can spend its money only once. So the price for this has been that teachers are relatively poorly paid and students have little learning time. And that's obviously not a good context to raise the status of the teaching profession. The point I want to just make here is not that Greece has very little money in education. It spends as much as Japan and Korea. But Japan and Korea invest their money much more closely in terms of raising teacher professionalism. Well, the first theme actually that we dealt with this morning at the summit was about how we can make schools more a center of communities in two ways. On the one hand, you know, schools can be great contributors to their communities through extracurricular activities, service learning, research projects, and so on. But schools can also draw on the resources of communities and support their communities. So this can actually become a virtuous relationship. And we heard an amazing range of examples where schools and communities really collaborate well and build on each other. Of course, there's also a challenge, you know, when we give a lot of responsibility to communities and communities are not equipped for that, then it can be a drag on, you know, school performance. I think it's a delicate kind of issue, and we heard positive and negative examples, but the relationship is very, very important. What we also saw is that many countries struggle with leveling the playing field. Often local communities are very different in wealth and cultural capital. So that, of course, you know, placed back into schools. Geographical segregation can lead to unequal opportunities. So this is a huge challenge for many countries. And what you can see on this chart is how uneven the playing field actually is. You know, this shows you the share of schools that run science competition. You know, that's an issue, or that's an example of, you know, extracurricular activity. You can see that share is in most countries much higher among privileged schools than it is among disadvantaged schools. We found the same relationship also when we looked at how educational resources are invested. No? You really want to be in the green part of the chart where, you know, you attract the most talented teachers into the most challenging classrooms, and you invest more resources into students that need those resources most. But in fact, what you can clearly see is that most countries are actually in the red part, meaning that actually if you are in a disadvantaged school, you're more likely to face greater shortages in teaching resources or material resources. So there's a long way to go for most education systems in better aligning resources with needs, where communities really need to play an important role. But we've also seen that poverty need not be destiny. You can see, for example, here the learning outcomes of students by decile of social background, in this case American schools, and you can see, yeah, you know, the 10% most disadvantaged students in the US come out at around the performance level of Mexico, the 10% most privileged around the performance level of Japan. So there's a big performance gap by wealth. And you look at this and you say, well, there's very little school systems can do about this. But then you look at Singapore, where the 10% most disadvantaged students, who are comparable with the 10% most disadvantaged students in the US, come out, as well as the average student in the United States. Or Shanghai in China, where the 10% most disadvantaged students do as well as the 10% most privileged students in the United States. So poverty need not be destiny. And that's the other part of the story, that actually some countries have shown that we can actually break that cycle between disadvantage and underperformance. And then the devices discussed here at the summit include various means. Some countries have put a lot of effort in managing and consolidating the school network, ensuring that there are there's a reasonable critical mass of students in school and in the communities. They use formula-based approaches to school financing. That's now quite popular, that you spend more money on schools with greater needs or to households and so on. Admission policies, we had examples on how controlled school choice can help, build the kind of regulatory environment to make voucher schools work. The effort of some countries to pair high and low performing schools, to share experiences, and also to engage parents and stakeholders. Very, very important devices these days. In fact, just show you some data on this, where students said their parents are interested in their school activities. We could see that students were 2.5 times as likely to want top grades at school, or they were more likely to be satisfied with life and less likely to feel lonely at school. So, in fact, students' perception of the parental interest seems to be really, in important ways, related to both outcomes, but also to life satisfaction of students. Parental engagement. We have seen that also when we looked at life satisfaction in more detail. You can see, for example, just spending time talking to my child had a very significant kind of relationship to students' reported life satisfaction. Eating the main meal with my child, discussing how well my child is doing. All those kinds of things seem to be very strong predictors for greater levels of life satisfaction among students. Same is also true for student activities. And now you can ask yourself, to what extent does this play out in performance? And also there you can see actually those students who reported that parents were talking to them actually scored significantly better on the PISA test as well, even after accounting for social background. Now you ask yourself why parents are not doing those things. And the answer is the meeting times are inconvenient, they were not able to get off from work, and so on. Those were the most prominent reasons of parental barriers to participation. But obviously, this is a very important area to tackle to increase the sort of presence of parents in the schooling day. Well, it can be a blessing, but also parental expectations can also be a drag. You can see, for example, that parents are a lot more likely to expect their sons rather than their daughters to enter a STEM career, even when the boys and girls do equally well in school. And we could see that even, after accounting for science performance. Now, you might think, you look at this picture, yeah, it's because the boys do better in science than the girls, but even when you control for that, on the PISA test, you could still see that parental expectations can also be that glass ceiling. And I think what this highlights is that, creating a level playing field is something that teachers alone can't do. It's really about, making learning and education everybody's business. Well, that's all I wanted to really share with you. I look forward to your questions. And of course, the summit is still underway. There will be probably lots of additional findings. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andreas. We actually have several questions that came in. The first one reads, you speak about the well-being of teachers, but teachers are known to work very long hours to fulfill all of their responsibilities. Are there countries where teachers are not working under stress?
Yeah, we don't actually have direct measures of stress, but we do have measures of teacher working hours, and they do vary a lot. The country where teachers work extremely long hours is Japan. It's probably true for many other workers as well. We cannot say that Japanese teachers are more stressed, but clearly Japanese teachers have a lot more responsibilities beyond the classroom. So, and there are countries where working hours of teachers are more modest. But as you say, in most countries, teachers spend significant hours, in the classroom, but then also beyond the classroom. What distinguishes countries even more, perhaps, is how they actually construct the teacher's working day. Now, if you are a teacher in the United States or in Britain, you spend most of your time in the classroom. You have actually quite limited time to do other things in teaching. If you're a teacher in Singapore or Japan or China and the Asian countries, actually you spend a lot less time in the classroom, maybe 15 hours, sometimes less, but you spend a lot more time on other things to prepare for your lessons, to work with other teachers, and so on. So those things are also very important. To what extent do teachers have the time for the things that make most of the difference in their work?
Thank you. We have another question from a participant who wants to know whether technology in the classroom hinders or boosts collaborative problem solving.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I must say we have been struggling with this on the PISA assessment. So far, we have seen that on the one hand, technology is a great tool to foster collaborative skills. Social networks, all those kinds of technologies actually are very, very interesting devices to enhance student collaboration. But actually, when we look at the evidence, we don't really see that relationship playing out in this way. They're both for cognitive outcomes, problem-solving skills, mathematics skills, even digital literacy and collaborative problem-solving. We could not see much of a positive relationship between technology intensity in classrooms and those outcomes, which again suggests that, sometimes the technology exists, sometimes it's used, but it may not be used in a way that it actually enhances those kinds of social skills that we know are very important.
Okay, we have another question that says, if the link between schools and their communities should be strengthened, shouldn't the business community play a part in this too?
In some countries it does. Actually, there are some countries in which the business community is a very active partner of schools in multiple ways. Sometimes students contribute to school projects, to research projects that then feed into industry. Can be projects. Sometimes there are internships, ways job placements. Sometimes people from the enterprise sector or from get into schools to explain, what the labor market is looking like and so on. So yeah, absolutely. There are very interesting examples for how society and the business sector actually can play a role to help students, build those connections.
Okay, and we have another question that asks, what types of professional development opportunities for teachers are most effective?
That's an interesting question. We have studied that quite extensively with our Thales survey. We found, initial teacher training is of course important, but the key to effective teaching is often the opportunities that teachers have in service to improve their professional practice. What is most important is the professional development that takes place at the school, in the school, in which teachers are professional learning communities, if well structured. Example, Singapore or Shanghai can be very, very effective. Means lesson studies as we see them in Japan. In Finland, we see collaborative research projects. I think those aspects are very, very important. In fact, we focus in our work on four things that we found particularly important: collaborative professional development, where teachers basically work together to frame better and good practice. Classroom observation, where teachers observe other teachers' classes, then analyze those outcomes and sort of, again, strive for better practice. And also joint teaching activities, where teachers work across the boundaries of subject disciplines on projects.
Okay, we have another question that asks about the summit. It says, what is the most interesting outcome of the International Teaching Summit you can share with us after the first day? Are countries facing the same challenges, and will the summit provide answers?
Well, I think the challenges are often similar, but the way in which countries approach them are often quite different. The nature of the relationship between teacher unions and governments, which are both present here, can be very different across countries. In some countries, that relationship may be a bit antagonistic. In other countries, it may be very kind of collaborative. And I think there's a lot we can learn from the nature of that relationship across countries. I think that, for me, is the most interesting findings. How does the teaching profession and government work together to, strive for better policies? Now, one thing that is very clear is where teachers are not involved in the design of policies, they are often not very well positioned to help with the implementation of those policies. So what we can see actually here, some countries very advanced in actually building their teachers into the solutions, involving teachers in curriculum design and curriculum development, involving teachers in continued professional development, in mentoring, in many kind of activities. So I think that kind of relationship is really important, and that's sort of something that comes out very prominently in the summit.
Okay, and we have another comment that says, getting communities to help may be a daunting task, given that in some countries there is no culture of parents in the community interacting with a teacher at their child's school. In fact, teachers seem to resent or feel threatened by any attempt on the part of parents to play a role in their child's education. Could you comment on this question?
Yeah, I think that kind of resentment is quite often observed, but you need to ask yourself, is it cause or effect? If the collaboration between parents and teachers is only focused on specific problems, I call you when I have difficulty with my child, well, then you almost program a confrontational relationship, because the moment the parent gets the call, you're going to be in a defensive kind of attitude. If teachers involve parents on a much more regular basis, in the day-to-day working of their schools, in the pedagogy, I think they can build a very trustful, very productive working relationship. And in one way, it's very hard for you as a teacher to do your job if you don't have all of those parents helping you. And to invest in that relationship is a very important part of good teaching practice. And it's again something that some countries, as we hear at the summit, are building very consciously into the design of the teaching jobs now.
Okay, well, that's all the time we have for this webinar, but thank you, Andreas, and thank you to our participants for your interest in the OECD's work on education. If you would like to find out more about PISA and the Teaching and Learning Survey, please visit our website, www.oecd.org/education, where you will also find a recorded version of today's webinar. Thank you once again for joining us.